Hello, I am Dr. Shivram Krishnan and welcome to the recording of journal entries using the modern method. This video will help you to distinguish the debit and credit of transactions, and this debit and credit is the technical aspect of accounting. At the end of this video, you would have learned to recognize how the dual aspect translates as dual concept or dual entry or as debit and credit. Secondly, you would have learned to record the debit and credit of a transaction in the modern method. This dual outlook which we saw is to be converted in technical terms in accounting known as the debit and credit of transactions. So what we are going to do is to look at the dual outlook of the transactions that we saw earlier and see how that is converted into debit and credit. We take the first one. So when we go back to the diagram and we see here that an increase in asset goes along with the 3 on the right hand side, and we represent this in the table. In the table here, we see that an increase in asset can be considered as a debit along with an increase in liabilities which is a credit, or a decrease in asset which is a credit, or an increase in revenue which is a credit. The dual aspect is that there is always in a transaction a debit and a credit. In the transaction that we saw earlier, received rupees 50,000 cash from R as initial capital, an increase in asset cash is debited rupees 50,000, the next is a credit. The credit is an increase in liability R's capital rupees 50,000. So the dual outlook allows us to record both the debit and the credit of each transaction. First we record the debit and then we identify the credit. In this transaction you saw that the debit was cash and the credit was R's capital. How do we look at the debit and credit for the transaction related to furniture? So the transaction was purchased furniture rupees 20,000 by paying cash. What is the debit and what is the credit in this transaction? Increase in asset which is furniture, this is debit rupees 20,000, and what is the credit? Decrease in asset which is cash rupees 20,000. Align this with the table. Now you see in the table that in order to identify the debit and then to identify the credit, one can look at whether the transaction results in an increase in assets, along with that whether the transaction results in an increase in liability, or it results in a decrease in asset, or it results in an increase in revenue. This is how we record the debit and credit of each transaction. Please remember, for each transaction there will be a debit and a credit. And we continue this with the other transactions. See these transactions. Purchased water cooler for the staff rupees 5,000, purchased trousers for rupees 12,000, paid for refreshment of staff rupees 220, received a loan of rupees 20,000 from Mr. Srinivas in cash, sold trousers for rupees 20,000 in cash, and gave a loan of rupees 1,000 to Mr. Kumar, a staff. These are the transactions. How do these transactions are transformed into debit and credit? See the recordings. The first one, purchased water cooler for staff rupees 5,000. The recording is in this manner. Increase in fixed asset, which is water cooler, debit rupees 5,000, and a decrease in current asset, cash, which is credit rupees 5,000. And so on, as we see for the other transaction. Please note that when we are recording, we never mention R Enterprises in the record, which means R Enterprises or the name of the business never gets recorded. Although it's always that it is R Enterprises which becomes the receiver or the giver. Now, why do we not note R Enterprises all the time? For the simple reason that we are recording these transactions in the books of R Enterprises itself. Having seen this video, let us summarize the learnings. The terms debit and credit have been coined to denote the dual aspect of each transaction. The first learning. The second learning is, in any transaction, first one has to find out the debit and then ascertain the credit to record the transaction. The key to remember is the very first transaction of a business, namely the owner invested a certain amount at the beginning, which results in increase in assets or cash, which is debited, an increase in liability, which is the owner's capital, which is to be credited. This is the most important learning that happened from this video.